In a world where respect is earned through rank and reputation, what happens when someone in the highest position of military authority makes a catastrophic error in judgment? What unfolds when a decorated Marine admiral, standing before thousands of troops, decides to publicly humiliate what he believes is just another lower-ranking soldier, only to discover he has just struck one of the most elite warriors in the entire United States military? This is not a story about revenge or military politics. This is about the moment when assumptions collide with reality, when arrogance meets its match, and when the true meaning of honor and respect gets redefined in front of an audience of 2,000 witnesses. Some moments change everything in an instant, and for Admiral Richardson and Navy SEAL Lieutenant Sarah Chen, this would be one of those moments that neither would ever forget. The military has strict codes of conduct, clear chains of command, and time-honored traditions. But what happens when those very traditions blind someone to the extraordinary capabilities of the person standing right in front of them? What you're about to discover is a true account that will challenge everything you think you know about judgment, respect, and the price of underestimating someone based on appearances alone. The morning sun cast long shadows across Naval Base San Diego, as nearly 2,000 troops gathered for the quarterly joint military exercise briefing. It was October 2019, and the air buzzed with the energy of soldiers, sailors, Marines, and airmen from different branches coming together for what would be one of the largest coordinated training operations of the year. Admiral James Richardson stood at the podium, his chest heavy with ribbons and medals that told the story of a distinguished 35-year career in the Marine Corps. At 58, he commanded respect wherever he went, his stern expression and commanding voice having shaped countless military careers. He had earned his position through decades of service, multiple deployments, and an unwavering commitment to military discipline and tradition. Among the sea of uniforms, Lieutenant Sarah Chen sat quietly in the third row, her Navy fatigues crisp and properly maintained. At first glance, she appeared to be just another sailor among the crowd. Her slight build, standing at 5'4" and weighing 125 pounds, drew no particular attention. Her dark hair was pulled back in the regulation style, and her face held the same focused expression as hundreds of others around her. What the Admiral and most others in that auditorium didn't know was that Sarah Chen was anything but ordinary. Hidden beneath her unassuming exterior was one of the most lethal and highly trained warriors in the entire United States military. She was a Navy SEAL, part of an elite unit so exclusive that less than 1% of those who attempt the training ever complete it. For the past 8 years, she had served in some of the most dangerous and classified operations around the world. Sarah had grown up in Portland, Oregon, the daughter of Chinese immigrants who owned a small restaurant. Her parents had instilled in her the values of hard work, discipline, and never backing down from a challenge. When other girls her age were focused on typical teenage activities, Sarah was training in martial arts, rock climbing, and pushing her physical limits in every way possible. She had always been driven by something deeper than ordinary ambition, a burning desire to serve her country and prove that limitations existed only in people's minds. Her journey to becoming a SEAL had been anything but easy. The basic underwater demolition/SEAL training, known simply as BUD/S, had pushed her to breaking points she didn't know existed. The constant physical demands, sleep deprivation, and mental challenges had eliminated nearly all of her fellow candidates. During Hell Week, the most grueling portion of the training, she had endured 5 days, with a total of maybe 4 hours of sleep, carrying telephone poles, swimming in frigid ocean water, and completing obstacle courses that would break most professional athletes. But Sarah had survived it all. More than survived, she had excelled. Her instructors noted her exceptional ability to remain calm under extreme pressure, her tactical intelligence, and her uncanny ability to lead others through the most challenging situations. After completing BUD/S, she had gone on to advanced training in demolitions, advanced firearms, close quarters combat, intelligence gathering, and specialized warfare techniques that remained classified. Over the following years, Sarah had participated in operations that would never be publicly acknowledged. She had served in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and several other locations that weren't supposed to exist on any official record. She had saved lives, eliminated high-value targets, and gathered intelligence that had prevented terrorist attacks on American soil. Her service record was filled with commendations and decorations, though many of them were classified and would never be displayed publicly. Despite her extraordinary background, Sarah never sought attention or recognition. She understood that her effectiveness came partly from her ability to blend in, to be underestimated, to move through the world without drawing the wrong kind of notice. In many ways, her unassuming appearance was one of her greatest tactical advantages. On this particular morning, she was attending the briefing as part of a special advisory role. Her unit had been asked to provide input on the training exercise, specifically regarding scenarios that might involve special operations elements. She sat quietly, taking notes and observing, as she had been trained to do. Admiral Richardson began his presentation by discussing the importance of military discipline, respect for chain of command, and maintaining proper military bearing at all times. His voice boomed through the auditorium sound system as he emphasized the values that he believed were fundamental to military success. "Ladies and gentlemen," the Admiral announced, "what we're going to discuss today is the foundation of everything we do in the military: respect, discipline, and understanding your place in the chain of command. These aren't just nice ideas. They're the difference between mission success and mission failure. They're the difference between coming home alive and not coming home at all." He continued for nearly 20 minutes, his presentation covering various aspects of the upcoming training exercise. The crowd listened attentively, with the occasional rustle of notebooks or quiet cough breaking the silence. Sarah continued taking notes, her pen moving steadily across the pages of her military-issued notebook. Then something unexpected happened. As Admiral Richardson was discussing the importance of military bearing and appearance, his eyes swept across the crowd and landed on Sarah. For reasons that would later be debated and analyzed, something about her presence in that moment triggered a reaction in him. Perhaps it was her relaxed posture, which he interpreted as lackadaisical. Perhaps it was the fact that she appeared to be one of the youngest people in the room, and he assumed she represented everything he felt was wrong with the newer generation of military personnel. Perhaps it was simply that he had been looking for an example to make his point about military discipline, and she happened to be in his line of sight at the wrong moment. "You," he said, pointing directly at Sarah. "Stand up." The auditorium fell silent. 2,000 pairs of eyes turned to look at the young sailor who had just been singled out by one of the highest-ranking officers in the room. Sarah looked up calmly, making direct eye contact with the Admiral. There was no fear in her expression, no apparent nervousness. She simply looked back at him with the steady gaze of someone who had faced far more dangerous situations than an angry superior officer. "I said stand up," Admiral Richardson repeated, his voice carrying the edge of authority that had intimidated countless subordinates over the decades. Sarah stood slowly, her movements controlled and precise. She came to a position of attention, her posture perfect, her expression neutral. She said nothing, waiting for whatever was coming next. "What's your name and rank?" the Admiral demanded. "Lieutenant Sarah Chen, United States Navy, sir," she replied clearly, her voice carrying easily through the silent auditorium. Admiral Richardson studied her for a moment, his expression showing clear disapproval. In his mind, he saw everything he felt was wrong with the modern military. A young officer who he assumed had been promoted too quickly, who probably hadn't seen real combat, who didn't understand what it meant to truly serve. "Lieutenant Chen," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "I've been watching you during this briefing, and frankly, I'm not impressed with your military bearing. You're slouching, you're not paying proper attention, and you're representing everything that's wrong with your generation of sailors." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah remained at attention, her expression unchanged. She had learned long ago that the best response to unjustified criticism was often no response at all. Let people reveal themselves through their words and actions. "Do you have anything to say for yourself?" the Admiral continued, clearly expecting either an apology or some kind of defensive response that would justify his public humiliation of her.
"No, sir," Sarah replied simply.
This was not the response Admiral Richardson had been expecting. He had anticipated either cowering submission or defensive arguing, either of which would have allowed him to continue his demonstration of authority. Her calm, controlled response seemed to frustrate him further. "No, sir," he repeated. "You're being called out for poor military bearing in front of 2,000 of your fellow service members, and all you have to say is no, sir? Do you understand the seriousness of what I'm telling you?" "Yes, sir," Sarah responded. The Admiral's face was beginning to redden. What had started as a simple example was turning into something more personal. He found himself becoming genuinely angry at what he perceived as disrespect and arrogance from someone he assumed was barely qualified to wear the uniform. "I don't think you do understand," he said, his voice rising. "I think you represent everything that's wrong with today's military. Too much promotion too fast, not enough real experience, not enough respect for the people who came before you and earned the right to wear those same uniforms." Sarah remained silent. Around the auditorium, 2,000 people watched in uncomfortable silence as one of the military's highest-ranking officers continued his public dressing down of what appeared to be a junior sailor. "I've served this country for 35 years, Admiral Richardson continued. "I've led men and women in combat. I've made decisions that saved lives. and I've earned every piece of metal on this chest through blood, sweat, and sacrifice. What have you done? What gives you the right to show such disrespect in my presence?" The question hung in the air. Sarah looked at him steadily, and for just a moment, something flickered in her eyes. Not fear, not anger, but something else. Something that might have warned the Admiral that he was about to make a mistake that would haunt him for the rest of his career. But he didn't see it. Or if he did see it, he misinterpreted it as defiance. What happened next would be talked about in military circles for years to come, analyzed and debated, and used as a cautionary tale about the dangers of assumptions and the importance of really knowing who you're dealing with before you decide to make an example out of them. Admiral Richardson took 3 steps forward, closing the distance between himself and Sarah Chen. The auditorium was so quiet that his footsteps seemed to echo like gunshots. "I asked you a question, Lieutenant," he said, now standing directly in front of her. "What have you done to earn the right to wear that uniform with such apparent lack of respect?" Sarah looked up at him, her expression still calm, still controlled. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but clear enough to carry throughout the silent auditorium. "I've done my job, sir," she said simply. It was the wrong answer, at least from Admiral Richardson's perspective. In his mind, it was the final confirmation of everything he had suspected about her attitude and character. Without thinking, without considering the consequences, without remembering that he was standing in front of 2,000 witnesses, he did something that would change both their lives forever. He raised his hand and struck her across the face. The sound of the slap echoed through the auditorium like a gunshot. For a moment, that seemed to stretch on forever. Nobody moved, nobody breathed. The Admiral stood there, his hands still raised, his face red with anger and authority. Sarah stood at attention, a red mark beginning to form on her left cheek, her expression unchanged. And in that moment, Admiral Richardson had just made the biggest mistake of his military career, because what he had just done was strike one of the most decorated and deadly warriors in the entire United States military. He had just publicly humiliated someone who had risked her life countless times for her country, someone who had earned respect through actions rather than rank, someone whose service record would make his own pale in comparison. But he didn't know that yet. None of the 2,000 witnesses knew that yet. They would all find out very soon. The silence that followed the slap was deafening. 2,000 military personnel sat frozen in their seats, processing what they had just witnessed. The sound of Admiral Richardson's hand connecting with Lieutenant Chen's face continued to echo in their minds, even as the actual sound had faded into the stunned quiet of the auditorium. Sarah Chen remained at attention, the red mark on her cheek growing more pronounced by the second. Her dark eyes stayed focused straight ahead, not looking at the Admiral, not looking at the crowd, but maintaining the perfect military bearing that she had been trained to display under any circumstances. Years of the most extreme training imaginable had prepared her for moments like this, though she had never expected to face such a situation from a fellow American officer. Admiral Richardson stood there for several seconds, his hands still partially raised, as if he couldn't quite believe what he had just done. The anger that had driven him to strike her was beginning to fade, replaced by a growing awareness that he might have just crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The absolute silence of the auditorium was not the silence of approval or respect. It was the silence of shock and horror. In the crowd, several officers were beginning to shift uncomfortably in their seats. Some were reaching for their phones. Others were exchanging worried glances with their colleagues. What they had just witnessed was not military discipline. It was assault, plain and simple, and it had happened in front of nearly 2,000 witnesses. Commander Patricia Williams, a Navy officer sitting in the 5th row, felt her stomach drop as she recognized Lieutenant Chen. Commander Williams was one of the few people in the auditorium who knew exactly who Sarah Chen was and what she represented. As a liaison officer who worked with special operations units, Williams had access to classified personnel files and had worked with SEAL teams on several occasions. The moment she saw Admiral Richardson single out Chen, she had felt a sense of dread about where things might be heading. Now, watching the young SEAL standing perfectly still with a red handprint on her face, Commander Williams knew that Admiral Richardson had just made a catastrophic error. She stood up slowly, her heart pounding, knowing that she had to do something to prevent this situation from spiraling completely out of control. "Admiral Richardson," she called out, her voice cutting through the silence. "Sir, if I may have a word." The Admiral turned to look at her, his expression showing irritation at being interrupted in what he clearly still believed was a justified disciplinary action. "Commander Williams, I'm in the middle of addressing a disciplinary issue. This can wait." "No, sir, it cannot wait. Williams replied firmly. She had served for 20 years and had never contradicted a superior officer in public, but she knew that what was happening had to be stopped immediately. You need to know who you just struck. I know exactly who I struck, Admiral Richardson snapped. A junior officer who was showing disrespect and needed to be reminded of proper military bearing. Commander Williams took a deep breath. What she was about to say would change everything for everyone in that room. Sir, Lieutenant Chen is not just any junior officer. She's a Navy SEAL. The words hit the auditorium like a physical blow. 2,000 people seemed to lean forward simultaneously, their minds struggling to process what they had just heard. Navy SEAL? The slight young woman standing at attention with a red mark on her face was one of the most elite warriors in the world? Admiral Richardson's face went through several changes in the space of a few seconds. Confusion, denial, and then the beginning of a horrible realization. That's impossible, he said. But his voice lacked conviction, Commander Williams continued, knowing that there was no going back now. Lieutenant Chen graduated from BUD/S training in 2011. She has served in classified operations across multiple theaters. She is currently assigned to SEAL Team 5 and has been decorated multiple times for valor under fire. Admiral, you just struck one of the most highly trained and decorated warriors in the United States military. The auditorium erupted. Not in applause or cheers, but in the low murmur of 2,000 people trying to process information that seemed impossible to believe. Sarah Chen, still standing at attention, still perfectly still, was a Navy SEAL. The same Navy SEALs who had taken out Osama bin Laden. The same elite unit that was called upon for the most dangerous and important military operations in the world. Admiral Richardson stood there, his face now pale instead of red, as the full magnitude of what he had done began to sink in. He had just publicly humiliated and physically struck one of the military's most elite operators based on nothing more than his own assumptions and prejudices, but the revelations were not over. Colonel Marcus Thompson, an Army Ranger sitting in the front row, stood up slowly. As a special operations officer himself, he had access to information that most of the people in the auditorium did not, and he knew that Commander Williams had only told them part of the story. Admiral, Colonel Thompson said, his voice carrying clearly through the now buzzing auditorium, there's more that you need to know. Admiral Richardson turned to face him, his expression showing a man who was beginning to realize that he was in far deeper trouble than he had initially understood. Lieutenant Chen isn't just any SEAL, Colonel Thompson continued. She's part of the unit that took out Ahmad Hassan al-Rashid last year. The name sent another shockwave through the crowd. Ahmad Hassan al-Rashid had been one of the most wanted terrorists in the world, responsible for multiple attacks on American interests overseas. His elimination had been headline news for weeks, though the details of the operation had remained classified. Now they were learning that the unassuming young woman standing in front of them had been part of that mission. She was the lead sniper on that operation, Colonel Thompson added. Her shot from 800 meters in a sandstorm saved the lives of 30 American hostages and eliminated one of the most dangerous men on the planet. The murmuring in the auditorium grew louder. People were pulling out their phones, some trying to look up information, others probably sending messages to colleagues who wouldn't believe what they were witnessing. Master Chief Petty Officer James Rodriguez, a Navy SEAL instructor who had been sitting quietly in the back row, decided that it was time for the full truth to come out. He stood up, his massive frame immediately commanding attention. I trained Lieutenant Chen, he announced, his voice booming through the auditorium. I've been a SEAL instructor for 15 years, and I've trained over 300 men and women who went on to join SEAL teams. Lieutenant Chen was the most naturally gifted warrior I've ever encountered. He paused, looking directly at Admiral Richardson. During her final training evaluation, she completed a 20-mile forced march carrying a full combat load in temperatures over 110 degrees, then immediately engaged and eliminated 15 hostile targets in a close-quarters battle simulation, treated 3 wounded civilians, and coordinated the extraction of her entire team, all while suffering from a broken rib that she never reported because she refused to quit. The auditorium was now filled with the sound of people talking, some standing up to get a better look at Sarah Chen, others simply staring in amazement at the young woman who had been publicly humiliated just minutes earlier. But Master Chief Rodriguez wasn't finished. She holds the training record for underwater navigation, long-range marksmanship, and tactical leadership. She speaks 4 languages fluently and has a master's degree in international relations. She has saved more American lives than most people in this auditorium will ever know, And she has done it all while maintaining the kind of humility and professionalism that I wish every officer could learn from. Admiral Richardson looked as if he might be physically sick. Each revelation was making his actions more inexcusable, more professionally damaging, and more personally humiliating. He had struck a war hero, an elite operator, someone whose service to the country far exceeded what most people could ever imagine. Captain Lisa Park, a military intelligence officer, stood up next. Admiral, Lieutenant Chen was awarded the Silver Star last year for actions in Syria. The citation is classified, but I can tell you that she single-handedly held off an enemy force 3 times the size of her unit while coordinating air support that saved an entire village from massacre. The Silver Star, one of the highest decorations for valor that the military awards. Admiral Richardson felt his knees go weak as he realized that he had just struck a Silver Star recipient in front of 2,000 witnesses. But there was still more. Lieutenant Colonel David Kim, an Air Force Special Operations officer, had been part of a joint operation with Sarah's unit 2 years earlier. He stood up slowly, his face grave. I was there in Afghanistan when Lieutenant Chen carried a wounded teammate 8 miles through enemy territory to reach an evacuation point. She was shot twice during the journey but refused medical attention until her teammate was safely on the helicopter. Her actions that day were the difference between a successful mission and a complete disaster. The picture being painted was devastating for Admiral Richardson. Each new piece of information about Sarah Chen's service record made his own behavior appear more petty, more ignorant, and more disgraceful. This wasn't just any sailor he had struck. This was someone who had repeatedly risked her life for her country. Someone who had earned her rank through extraordinary service. Someone who represented the very best of what the military could produce. Sarah Chen herself remained silent through all of these revelations. She had not asked for her record to be made public. She had not sought vindication or sympathy. She simply continued to stand at attention, maintaining the composure and professionalism that had defined her entire career. Admiral Richardson finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. Lieutenant Chen, What could he possibly say? How could he apologize for actions that were completely inexcusable? How could he explain that he had allowed his own assumptions and prejudices to blind him to the fact that he was dealing with one of America's most decorated warriors? The auditorium had become chaotic. People were standing, talking, pointing, taking pictures with their phones, despite regulations against recording military proceedings. Officers were huddled in small groups, discussing the implications of what they had just witnessed. Some were already making phone calls, knowing that this incident would need to be reported up the chain of command immediately. Commander Williams approached the podium, where Admiral Richardson stood frozen. "Sir," she said quietly but firmly, "this briefing needs to end now. You need to seek immediate legal counsel. And Lieutenant Chen needs to be offered appropriate medical attention and victim assistance resources." Admiral Richardson nodded numbly. The briefing that was supposed to demonstrate military discipline and proper bearing had become the biggest scandal of his career. He had humiliated himself in front of 2,000 witnesses, committed assault against a decorated war hero, and demonstrated exactly the kind of judgment that made him unfit for command. But perhaps most importantly, he had revealed something ugly about himself, about his assumptions, about his willingness to abuse his authority based on nothing more than prejudice and ignorance. And he had done it all in front of an audience that would never forget what they had seen. As the auditorium began to empty, people filing out in small groups while talking in hushed, excited tones. Sarah Chen finally moved. She relaxed her position of attention and began walking toward the exit, her stride confident and controlled despite everything that had happened. Master Chief Rodriguez intercepted her near the door. "Chen," he said quietly, "are you okay?" She looked up at him and, for the first time since the incident began, allowed herself a small smile. "I've had worse days, Master Chief." "I know you have," he replied. "But this isn't over. What he did to you, what happened here today, this is going to have consequences." Sarah nodded. "I know. But that's not my concern right now. I just want to get back to my unit and continue doing my job." As she walked out of the auditorium, leaving behind one of the most shocking incidents in recent military history, Sarah Chen was thinking about the mission briefing she had scheduled for the following morning. She had more important things to worry about than the career-ending mistake of an admiral who had let his prejudices cloud his judgment. Behind her, Admiral Richardson stood alone at the podium, facing the destruction of everything he had spent 35 years building, all because he had assumed he knew everything about a person based on their appearance and rank. Within 6 hours of the incident at Naval Base San Diego, the story had traveled through military networks faster than any classified intelligence briefing in recent memory. Phone calls were being made to the Pentagon, text messages were flying between officers across multiple bases, and formal reports were being written that would fundamentally change the careers of everyone involved. Admiral Richardson sat in his office, staring at the formal letter of resignation that he had just finished typing. His 35-year career was over, and he knew it. There was no coming back from what he had done, no way to explain or justify striking a decorated Navy SEAL in front of 2,000 witnesses. His military legacy, which he had spent decades building, had been destroyed in a single moment of poor judgment and unchecked authority. The phone on his desk had been ringing almost constantly since he returned from the auditorium. Reporters were somehow already getting wind of the story. His superiors wanted immediate explanations. Legal representatives were demanding meetings. And through it all, the image of Sarah Chen, standing perfectly still, with a red mark on her face, continued to haunt him. At 1800 hours, Admiral Richardson received the call he had been dreading. Admiral Patricia Hayes, Chief of Naval Operations, and one of the highest-ranking officers in the Navy, was on the line. Her voice was cold and professional, but the anger underneath was unmistakable. "Richardson, I've been briefed on what happened today. Tell me it's not as bad as it sounds." "It's worse," Admiral Richardson replied quietly. "Admiral Hayes, I made a mistake that I can never take back. I struck a Navy SEAL in front of 2,000 personnel, based on nothing more than my own assumptions about her bearing and attitude." The silence on the other end of the line lasted for nearly 30 seconds. When Admiral Hayes finally spoke, her voice was carefully controlled. "Do you understand what you've done? Do you comprehend the damage you've caused not just to your own career, but to the reputation of the entire officer corps?" "Yes, ma'am, I do." "No, I don't think you do." Admiral Hayes continued. "Lieutenant Chen is not just any SEAL. She is one of our most valuable operators. She has participated in missions that have saved hundreds of American lives. She has been personally commended by 3 different presidents for her service. And you struck her in public because you didn't like the way she was sitting." Admiral Richardson closed his eyes. Each word was like a physical blow, but he knew he deserved every one of them. "I have your resignation letter in front of me," Admiral Hayes continued. "It's effective immediately. You will be subject to court-martial proceedings for assault, conduct unbecoming an officer, and violation of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Your retirement benefits are under review, and there will likely be criminal charges filed as well." The call ended without pleasantries. Admiral Richardson sat in the gathering darkness of his office, contemplating the complete destruction of everything he had worked for throughout his adult life. Meanwhile, at a secure facility across the base, Sarah Chen was sitting in a small conference room with her commanding officer, Captain Michael Torres, and a representative from the Judge Advocate General's office. Despite repeated offers of medical attention and counseling services, Sarah had insisted that she was fine and ready to discuss the legal implications of what had happened. "Sarah," Captain Torres said, using her first name in a rare break from military protocol, "I want you to know that the entire SEAL community is behind you on this. What Admiral Richardson did was completely unacceptable, and there will be serious consequences." Sarah nodded. "I appreciate that, Captain, but I want to make something clear from the beginning. I'm not interested in this becoming a media circus or a platform for anyone's political agenda. I want Admiral Richardson to face appropriate military justice, but I don't want this incident to overshadow the important work that we do." Lieutenant Colonel Jennifer Walsh from the JAG office leaned forward. "Lieutenant Chen, I have to tell you that this case is likely to receive significant public attention, regardless of your preferences. Assault of a service member by a superior officer is always serious, but when the victim is a decorated SEAL and the incident occurred in front of 2,000 witnesses, it becomes a matter of significant legal and public interest." "I understand that," Sarah replied. "But I want to make sure that whatever happens serves the cause of justice and military discipline, not just sensationalism." Over the following 48 hours, the story began to leak to the media despite military attempts to control the information flow. Several witnesses had recorded portions of the incident on their phones, and while official military proceedings prohibited the release of such recordings, rumors and second-hand accounts began appearing on military blogs and social media platforms. The first major news outlet to pick up the story was Military Times, which published an article titled "Admiral Under Investigation After Allegedly Striking Decorated SEAL." The article was careful to note that the investigation was ongoing and that many details remained classified. but it confirmed the basic facts. A Marine admiral had struck a Navy SEAL during a public briefing, and the incident was being investigated at the highest levels. Within 24 hours, the story had been picked up by CNN, Fox News, NBC, and every other major news network. The public reaction was swift and overwhelmingly critical of Admiral Richardson's actions. Social media platforms were flooded with comments from veterans and civilians alike, expressing outrage at what many saw as an abuse of authority and a betrayal of military values. One of the most powerful responses came from Admiral William Morrison, a retired Navy SEAL who had served as the commanding officer of Sarah's unit during her first deployment. He released a public statement that was picked up by news outlets across the country. "I have known Lieutenant Sarah Chen for 8 years, and I can say without hesitation that she represents everything that is best about the United States military. She is a warrior, a leader, and a patriot who has repeatedly risked her life in service to this nation. For anyone to lay hands on her in anger is not just an assault on her personally, but an assault on the values and principles that every service member swears to uphold." The statement went on to detail some of Sarah's classified achievements, with appropriate clearances obtained for public release. The American public learned that the quiet young woman who had been struck by Admiral Richardson had participated in over 50 combat missions, had saved the lives of dozens of American hostages, and had been wounded in action multiple times while continuing to serve with distinction. President Johnson, when asked about the incident during a press conference, stated simply, "Lieutenant Chen is an American hero, and what happened to her is completely unacceptable. The military justice system will handle this matter appropriately, and I have full confidence in that process." While the media attention continued to grow, Sarah herself remained largely out of the public eye. She continued her regular duties with her SEAL unit, participated in training exercises, and conducted herself with the same professionalism that had defined her entire career. When approached by reporters, she politely declined all interviews, referring all questions to official military spokespersons. The court-martial proceedings began 3 weeks after the incident. Admiral Richardson, represented by Military Defense Counsel, had initially considered pleading not guilty and claiming that his actions were justified military discipline. However, after reviewing the overwhelming evidence and witness testimony, he changed his plea to guilty on all charges. The courtroom was packed with military personnel and media representatives as the proceedings began. Sarah Chen, testifying as the primary victim, took the stand wearing her dress blue uniform with her ribbons and decorations clearly visible. Her testimony was brief and factual, focusing on what had happened rather than how it had made her feel. "Admiral Richardson struck me across the face without warning and without justification," she testified. "I was standing at attention and responding to his questions appropriately. There was no provocation for his actions and no military regulation that would have authorized such physical discipline." When asked about the impact of the incident on her personally and professionally, Sarah's answer surprised many in the courtroom. "Your Honor, I have faced enemy fire in multiple combat zones. I have been shot, injured, and threatened by people who want to destroy everything that America represents. Admiral Richardson's actions were disappointing and inappropriate, but they do not define me, they do not diminish my commitment to serving this country, and they will not prevent me from continuing to do my job to the best of my ability." The defense had little to present in Admiral Richardson's favor. Multiple witnesses testified about the incident, confirming that there had been no provocation for the Admiral's actions, and that Sarah had conducted herself appropriately throughout the confrontation. Character witnesses spoke to Admiral Richardson's previous service record, but none could justify or explain his behavior on that day. In his own testimony, Admiral Richardson took full responsibility for his actions. "Your Honor, there is no excuse for what I did. I allowed my own assumptions and prejudices to cloud my judgment, and I struck a fellow service member without cause or justification. Lieutenant Chen did nothing wrong, and my actions were a complete violation of military discipline, military law, and basic human decency." He paused, looking directly at Sarah Chen before continuing. "Lieutenant Chen, I know that my apology cannot undo what I did to you, but I want you and everyone in this courtroom to know that my actions reflected my own failures, not any shortcoming on your part. You are everything that a military officer should aspire to be, and I am ashamed that I allowed my own ignorance to blind me to that fact." The military judge, Colonel Rebecca Martinez, delivered her verdict after 3 days of proceedings. Admiral Richardson was found guilty on all charges: assault, conduct unbecoming an officer, and violation of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. He was sentenced to dismissal from service, forfeiture of all pay and allowances, and 6 months of confinement. More significantly, Colonel Martinez used her closing remarks to address the broader implications of the case. This incident represents a failure of leadership at the highest levels. Admiral Richardson's actions were not just a personal failing, but a demonstration of the kind of assumptions and prejudices that have no place in the modern military. The fact that he could look at Lieutenant Chen and see only someone to be criticized rather than someone to be respected shows a fundamental misunderstanding of what military leadership should be. She continued, Lieutenant Chen's response to this incident, her professionalism in the face of completely inappropriate treatment, and her commitment to her duties despite being wronged by the system she serves, represents the very best of military values. She has conducted herself with honor throughout this ordeal, and she deserves our respect and gratitude. Following the court-martial, Admiral Richardson was escorted from the courthouse in handcuffs. His 35-year military career was over, his reputation destroyed, and his legacy forever tainted by a single moment of poor judgment and unchecked authority. Sarah Chen returned to her unit and continued serving with distinction. The incident had made her something of a public figure, but she consistently avoided the spotlight, preferring to let her service record speak for itself. She was promoted to lieutenant commander 6 months later, and continued to participate in classified operations that would never be publicly acknowledged. The incident at Naval Base San Diego became a case study in military academies and leadership training programs across the country. It was used to illustrate the dangers of assumption, the importance of knowing the people you lead, and the consequences of allowing rank and authority to override judgment and common decency. 5 years later, Sarah Chen had been promoted to commander and was serving as an instructor at the Naval Special Warfare School, training the next generation of SEALs. In her classes on leadership and military ethics, she would sometimes reference the incident with Admiral Richardson, though she never identified herself as the victim in the story. Remember, she would tell her students, true leadership is not about using your authority to dominate others. It's about recognizing the value and potential in every person you encounter, regardless of their rank, their appearance, or your assumptions about who they are. The moment you think you know everything about someone based on what you can see on the surface is the moment you become unfit to lead them.
The story of Admiral Richardson and Lieutenant Sarah Chen became more than just a military scandal.
It became a lesson about respect, assumption, and the danger of judging people based on appearances rather than understanding who they really are and what they have accomplished. It reminded everyone, military and civilian alike, that real strength often comes in packages that we don't expect, and that true leadership requires humility, wisdom, and the courage to admit when we are wrong. In the end, the incident that was meant to demonstrate military discipline became a demonstration of military justice, and the young woman who was meant to be humiliated became an inspiration to service members around the world. Sometimes the most powerful lessons come from the most unexpected places, and sometimes the people we least expect to teach us something end up changing everything we thought we knew about leadership, respect, and the true meaning of service.